The storm battered the streets outside, a relentless downpour that turned the sidewalks into rivers. Inside the shelter, warmth battled against the cold reality of the world outside. The room buzzed with muted conversations and the clatter of dishes as volunteers handed out bowls of steaming soup to the weary faces gathered there. Lyra Moon, a petite 7-year-old with unruly curls and a hopeful smile, sat cross-legged on the floor. Her tiny hands gripped an envelope as though it held the secrets to the universe. Her eyes sparkled, and her lips moved silently, rehearsing words she hadn't quite mastered the courage to say aloud. Her mother, Seraphine, stood nearby, leaning against the wall with a weariness that seemed etched into her bones. The years had been hard on her, but there was still a quiet dignity about her. She wore her hardships like an invisible armor, protecting her daughter from the weight of the world. Seraphine watched Lyra with a mix of pride and unease, knowing exactly what was in that envelope and dreading what might happen when it was delivered. The sound of tires splashing through puddles interrupted the soft hum of the shelter. All heads turned as the doors opened, letting in a gust of cold air and a man who seemed to carry the storm with him. Calum Voss stepped inside, his imposing frame and sharp suit a stark contrast to the modest surroundings. His presence seemed to pull the warmth from the room, and his expression was one of polite disinterest, as if he were already counting the minutes until he could leave. Lyra's heart raced as she recognized him. "Mom?" she whispered urgently, tugging at Seraphine's sleeve. "That's him, isn't it? The man from the news?" Seraphine stiffened. "Yes, Lyra, but let him be. He's not here for us." Lyra shook her head. "But he needs to read it," she insisted, clutching the envelope even tighter. Before Seraphine could stop her, Lyra was already on her feet, her small frame weaving through the crowd like a determined thread in a frayed fabric. Calum barely noticed the child at first, too focused on the assistant at his side who was whispering details about the photo op. But then he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. He looked down and met Lyra's wide, expectant eyes. "Hi, sir," she said, her voice trembling but unwavering. "My mom wrote this for you. Please read it." For a moment, Calum simply stared, unsure how to respond. He glanced at the envelope, then at the little girl, whose hopeful expression made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite explain. He took the envelope out of sheer habit, a man used to accepting documents without much thought. "Thank you," he said, his tone clipped, intending to discard it as soon as he could. But Lyra didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, unwavering, as though waiting for something more. "You'll read it, won't you?" she asked. Her voice carried a sincerity that pierced through the shield of detachment he wore so carefully. Calum nodded once, more out of a desire to end the interaction than any real intention. "Sure," he said, tucking the envelope into his pocket. Lyra beamed at him, a smile so genuine it unsettled him further. She turned and ran back to her mother, who pulled her close, whispering something Calum couldn't hear. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt a pang of guilt as he watched them. The room had returned to its hum of activity, but Calum felt oddly out of place, as though he were standing on a stage he hadn't asked to be on. He patted his pocket absently, where the envelope seemed heavier than it should. Shaking off the strange sensation, he turned back to his assistant and gestured toward the exit. "We've been here long enough," he muttered. Outside, the storm raged on, and as Calum stepped back into the cold, the letter in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. The rain hammered against the roof of the car as it wove through the city streets. Calum Voss sat rigid in the back seat, the muted glow of streetlights casting fleeting shadows across his sharp features. His assistant, Julian, tapped away on his tablet, filling the silence with the faint clicks of a keyboard. But Calum wasn't listening. His hand rested against his pocket, fingers brushing against the crinkled envelope. He told himself it was nothing, just a childish gesture that didn't warrant his attention. Yet it weighed on him like a stone. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out, the edges worn from being handled. His name, written in careful block letters, was scrawled across the front in a child's hand. He sighed, a sharp exhale that caught Julian's attention. "Something wrong?" Julian asked, not looking up from his screen. "No," Calum replied curtly. He hesitated, then set the envelope on the seat beside him, determined to forget about it. But the moment he did, Lyra's voice echoed in his mind. "You'll read it, won't you?" He frowned. What had compelled that child to approach him? She didn't ask for anything, didn't beg or plead as others often did. She simply asked him to read it. Against his better judgment, he picked it up again and tore the seal. The letter inside was handwritten in a neat, flowing script, each word pressed deeply into the paper as though the writer had poured herself into it. Calum's eyes skimmed the first few lines, but soon his gaze slowed, caught by the weight of the words. "Dear Mr. Voss, I don't expect you to remember me, but your decisions have shaped my life more than you'll ever know. Years ago, your company acquired and dismantled a small magazine where I worked. It was more than a job. It was my passion, my livelihood. When it closed, I lost everything. I was a young widow with a daughter to care for, and I didn't have the luxury of starting over. But this letter isn't about blame. It's about hope. I'm writing to you because I believe people can change. I've had to change in ways I never imagined just to survive. And yet, despite the pain, I've found purpose here at this shelter, helping others who've lost their way. But not everyone has that chance, Mr. Voss. For every success story, there are countless people left behind by decisions made in boardrooms far away. Decisions like yours. You have the power to be different, to make choices that lift people up instead of leaving them behind. I hope you'll consider that power carefully. Not for me, but for the countless others who will never get the chance to speak to you." Sincerely, Seraphine Moon Calum stared at the letter long after finishing it, his chest tightening with a strange mixture of guilt and anger. He didn't like the way the words made him feel, like a spotlight had been turned on a part of himself he preferred to ignore. "Everything all right?" Julian asked again, his tone more cautious now. Calum folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Just a bit of unsolicited advice." But as the car pulled up to his high-rise, Calum didn't move to get out. He sat in the dim light, staring at the towering structure that represented everything he had built. The rain slid down the windows in jagged trails, distorting the world outside. For the first time in years, he felt the sharp tug of a memory he had long buried. His own childhood, marked by hunger and cold nights in shelters like the one he had just left. Shaking his head, he forced the memory away and stepped out into the rain. The letter remained tucked in his pocket, heavier now, as though it had fused itself to his conscience. Calum couldn't sleep that night. He paced the expanse of his penthouse, the lights of the city stretching endlessly beneath him. The view was meant to inspire pride, a testament to how far he had come from the poverty he once knew. But tonight, it felt like an accusation. The letter sat on the glass coffee table, a silent weight in the room. He tried to ignore it, distracting himself with emails and reports, but the words replayed in his mind. "Decisions like yours." With a sharp exhale, he snatched up the letter and read it again. This time, slower. Seraphine's words hit harder, her story weaving itself into his thoughts. He tried to dismiss it as sentimentality, a carefully crafted plea designed to provoke guilt. Yet there was a rawness to it, a truth that gnawed at him. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stared out at the storm still raging outside. The memories he had spent decades suppressing began to surface. He remembered the sting of hunger, the shame of eviction notices pinned to the front door, and the humiliation of standing in line at shelters with his mother, who had always tried to shield him from the worst of it. "You have the power to be different." The line echoed in his mind. Hadn't he sworn as a young man that he would be different? That he would escape the cycle of poverty and create a life where he would never feel powerless again? Yet somewhere along the way, he had traded compassion for ambition, kindness for efficiency. His phone buzzed on the counter, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Julian. "Calum," Julian said when he answered, "there's something I think you should see." Calum frowned. "At this hour?" "It's about that shelter you visited. There's a file from the acquisition archives you might want to look at. I sent it to your email." Calum hung up and opened his laptop, curiosity mingling with unease. Within minutes, he found the file Julian had mentioned. It was from a decade ago when Voss Global Ventures had acquired a small publishing company on the brink of bankruptcy. He barely remembered the deal, one of dozens he had executed that year. But as he scrolled through the details, a name jumped out at him. Lyra Moon. She had been one of the senior contributors at the magazine, her articles among the most praised. There was even a brief note from his acquisition team recommending that her position be retained due to her talent. But it was marked with a red line and a single word in the margin. Expendable. His chest tightened. He didn't need to search further to know who had made that decision. The weight of it settled on him like a physical thing. How many others had he dismissed as mere lines on a spreadsheet? How many lives had he upended in his quest to climb higher? For the first time in years, Calum felt something he had worked hard to suppress. Shame, the kind that gnawed at his insides and refused to let go. Unable to sit still, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The storm had quieted to a light drizzle, but the air was cold, biting against his skin as he stepped outside. The city's glittering skyline stretched before him, but for once, it held no comfort. His driver looked startled as Calum climbed into the back seat. "Back to the shelter," Calum ordered, his voice firm. The driver hesitated. "Sir, it's nearly midnight." "Just drive," Calum snapped. As the car rolled through the quiet streets, Calum clenched his fists in his lap. He didn't know what he would say when he got there, or if Seraphine would even agree to see him. All he knew was that he couldn't leave things as they were. The letter had cracked something open inside him, and now it refused to be sealed again. The shelter was quiet when Calum arrived, the hum of activity replaced by the stillness of the late hour. The fluorescent lights cast a dim glow over the room, where a few residents were still awake, talking softly or tidying up. The storm had passed, leaving the air damp and heavy. Calum hesitated at the door, his polished shoes feeling out of place against the worn linoleum floor. He spotted Seraphine immediately. She was sitting at a table near the back, her head bowed as she sorted through a stack of donated clothes. Lyra was curled up on a makeshift bed nearby, clutching a worn stuffed bear. Seraphine looked up, sensing his presence, and her eyes widened in surprise. She froze, her hands stilling over a faded sweater. Calum cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward. "Ms. Moon," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour." Seraphine stood slowly, her gaze wary. "Mr. Voss," she said, folding her arms. "I didn't expect to see you again. Is something wrong?" He glanced at Lyra, her small face peaceful in sleep, and then back at Seraphine. The words he had rehearsed in the car now felt inadequate, slipping from his grasp like water through his fingers. "I read your letter," he began, his tone measured but sincere. "And I needed to come back. There's something I need to say." Seraphine's expression remained guarded, her exhaustion mingling with curiosity. She gestured toward an empty chair, and he sat, feeling uncharacteristically out of his element. "I didn't realize," he admitted, meeting her gaze. "About what happened with the magazine. About how my decisions affected you. Affected so many people." He paused, searching for the right words. "I've made choices in my career that I thought were necessary, efficient, but I never stopped to think about the lives behind those decisions." Seraphine's face softened, though her voice carried an edge. "And now you're here. Why?" Calum hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Because your letter reminded me of who I used to be," he said, his voice raw. "I grew up in places like this. My mother struggled every day to keep us fed, to keep a roof over our heads, and I promised myself that I'd never feel powerless again. But somewhere along the way, I forgot. I became the kind of person I once resented." For a long moment, Seraphine said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Finally, she sighed, sinking back into her chair. "Mr. Voss," she began, her tone measured, "I didn't write that letter to make you feel guilty. I wrote it because I believe people like you can change. But words are easy. What matters is what you do with them." Calum nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "You're right," he said. "And I want to start by helping here. I'll fund the shelter, whatever you need to expand, to reach more people. I'll make sure no one here has to struggle the way my mother did." Seraphine studied him, her expression unreadable. "That's generous," she said carefully. "But charity alone won't fix the problems you've created, Mr. Voss. If you're serious about change, you need to look at the systems you've built, the ones that make shelters like this necessary in the first place." Her words struck him like a blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He nodded slowly, the realization dawning on him. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I'm willing to start listening, to learn, if you'll help me." Seraphine's lips curved into a faint smile, the first he had seen from her. "That's a start," she said simply. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of the conversation hanging between them. Calum glanced at Lyra, who stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny hand clutching the bear closer. "You've raised an incredible daughter," he said quietly. Seraphine followed his gaze, her expression softening. "She's the reason I keep going," she said. "She's my hope." Calum nodded, understanding now why the little girl's words had struck him so deeply. He rose to his feet, extending his hand. "Thank you for the letter, for reminding me of what matters." Seraphine hesitated, then took his hand, her grip firm. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Voss. Show me what you'll do next." He left the shelter that night with a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Calum Voss felt a spark of purpose, not just for his business, but for himself. The letter remained tucked in his pocket, a quiet reminder of the power of small acts and the voices of those who dared to speak up. The days following his visit to the shelter were unlike anything Calum Voss had experienced in years. For the first time, he wasn't consumed by quarterly reports, expansion strategies, or shareholder calls. Instead, he found himself poring over documents from his company's archives, reports of acquisitions, layoffs, and closures. Each file felt like a stone being placed on a scale, a weight of accountability he could no longer ignore. He realized how deeply the culture he had cultivated at Voss Global Ventures mirrored his own ruthless climb to the top. Efficient, calculating, and devoid of empathy. The system rewarded profit above all else, leaving lives like Seraphine's shattered in its wake. His assistant, Julian, noticed the shift almost immediately. "Calum, are you all right?" Julian asked one afternoon, stepping into his office. "You've been locked in here for hours. You even missed the board meeting this morning." Calum didn't look up from the papers scattered across his desk. Julian, do you know how many jobs we've eliminated in the last decade? Julian hesitated, caught off guard. I don't have the exact number. Calum gestured at the stacks of files. Tens of thousands, he said, his voice heavy. Entire livelihoods gone, entire families uprooted. And for what? To cut costs? To impress investors? Julian closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. That's how the game works, Calum. You know that. It's business. No, Calum said sharply, looking up for the first time. His eyes were shadowed, but there was a fire in them that Julian hadn't seen in years. It's my business. I built this. I can change it. Julian raised an eyebrow. Change it? You're talking about dismantling everything we've built? Do you realize what the board will say? What the investors will do? They'll adapt, Calum said firmly. Or they'll leave. I'm done running this company like a machine. It's time to put people first. Julian stared at him, incredulous. And what about the bottom line? Calum leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe the bottom line isn't the most important thing. The conversation marked the beginning of a seismic shift at Voss Global Ventures. Over the next few weeks, Calum spearheaded a complete audit of the company's practices. He brought in outside advisors, community leaders, and even former employees to discuss how the company could rebuild trust and repair the damage it had caused. It was a slow, grueling process, and the backlash was immediate. The media labeled him a hypocrite, investors threatened to pull out, and the board demanded explanations for his sudden pivot. But Calum pressed on, driven by something he couldn't quite articulate. A need to make amends, not just for himself, but for the countless lives his decisions had touched. One evening, as he worked late in his office, a knock at the door startled him. He looked up to see Seraphine standing there, holding a book in her hands. Her expression was cautious but curious. I wasn't sure if you'd actually follow through, she said, stepping inside. Calum smiled faintly. I figured you'd come to check up on me eventually. She placed the book on his desk, a collection of stories written by residents of the shelter. The title read, The Voices We Forgot. I wanted you to have this, she said. It's their stories, the ones we overlook, the ones we ignore. You might find them useful. He picked up the book, flipping through its pages. Each story was a testament to resilience, a reminder of the humanity behind the statistics he had once dismissed. Thank you, he said quietly. For this. For everything. Seraphine studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're trying, Calum. That's more than most would do. But you've got a long way to go. I know, he replied, and I'm ready for it. As she turned to leave, Lyra appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw him. She ran to his desk, holding a piece of paper in her hand. Mr. Voss, she said excitedly, I wrote you something. Calum took the paper from her, unfolding it carefully. It was a drawing of the shelter, with Lyra and Seraphine standing in the foreground. Beside them, a man in a suit, clearly meant to be Calum, was holding hands with them both. Above it, in bright, blocky letters, she had written, Thank you for listening. He felt his throat tighten as he looked at the simple, heartfelt gesture. This is beautiful, Lyra, he said, his voice thick. I'll treasure it. Lyra beamed, and Seraphine smiled softly, her guarded expression easing for the first time. As they left, Calum sat in silence, the drawing and the book side by side on his desk. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he felt he was on the right path, not just as a CEO, but as a person. Calum Voss stood on the stage of a packed conference room, the murmur of voices echoing off the high ceilings. The audience before him was a mix of skeptical investors, wary board members, and curious journalists, their expressions ranging from disinterest to outright suspicion. This was his moment to address the seismic shift he had set into motion, and the weight of it pressed down on him like never before. He adjusted the microphone, the faint feedback silencing the crowd. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on faces that had once been allies, adversaries, and everything in between. Clearing his throat, he began, his voice steady, but filled with something unfamiliar: vulnerability. I built this company with one goal: to succeed. I told myself that success meant climbing higher, earning more, and staying ahead of the competition. And for years, I believed I was doing exactly that. But recently, I was reminded of something I had lost sight of. A simple truth that's easy to forget when you're focused on the numbers. He paused, glancing at the letter in his hand, its edges worn from being read and reread. Success means nothing if it comes at the cost of people's lives, their dreams, and their dignity. I've spent weeks reflecting on the impact of the decisions I've made as the head of Voss Global Ventures, and I've realized that those decisions have caused harm I can no longer ignore. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Calum pressed on, his voice growing stronger. This isn't about damage control or optics. This is about accountability. Effective immediately, we're implementing sweeping changes to how this company operates. We will no longer measure success solely by profits, but by the impact we have on the communities we touch. He gestured to a slide behind him where a bold headline read, "A new vision, building for people, not just profit." The room buzzed with whispers as the details began to appear. Investment in affordable housing projects, funding for community programs, and a commitment to ethical business practices. Julian stood at the edge of the stage, watching with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Calum had told him about the plan, but hearing it delivered with such conviction was another thing entirely. He had expected resistance, even outrage, but there was a strange quiet in the room, as though the audience was holding its collective breath. "I know this won't be easy," Calum continued, "and I know I'll face criticism for these decisions. But I also know this: change starts with those who have the power to make it happen. For too long, I've ignored that responsibility. Not anymore." As he stepped back from the microphone, the room erupted into a mix of applause and raised voices. Questions flew from reporters, hands shot up from investors, and the board members exchanged tense glances. But amid the chaos, Calum felt an odd sense of peace. For the first time in years, he was doing something not for approval or accolades, but because it was right. A few weeks later, Calum returned to the shelter, this time without the weight of suits or speeches. He walked through the doors as a man still learning, still striving, but unburdened by the facade he had worn for so long. The residents greeted him with cautious smiles, and the staff offered nods of approval. Word of his actions had spread, but Calum knew trust wasn't something he could earn overnight. He found Seraphine in the kitchen, chopping vegetables alongside a group of volunteers. She glanced up as he approached, her expression calm but curious. "You're back," she said, setting the knife down. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." Calum nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not done learning yet," he said, "and I figured this was as good a place as any to start." She arched a brow, but there was a flicker of approval in her gaze. "Well, there's always work to do around here. You willing to get your hands dirty?" "Absolutely," he replied, rolling up his sleeves. As they worked side by side, the noise of the shelter hummed around them, a symphony of resilience and hope. Lyra appeared a short while later, her ever-present smile lighting up the room. She tugged at Calum's arm, holding up a fresh drawing. This time, it was a picture of a thriving shelter, surrounded by tall buildings with banners that read, "Hope starts here." In the center, 3 figures stood hand in hand: Lyra, Seraphine, and Calum. He knelt to her level, taking the drawing with reverence. "You know Lyra?" I think you might be the best artist I've ever met." She giggled, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "And you're the best listener." As the day unfolded, Calum found himself blending into the rhythm of the shelter, no longer a CEO towering above the crowd, but a man standing shoulder to shoulder with the people he had once overlooked. The journey ahead would be long, but for the first time, it felt like a road worth traveling. That evening, as Calum stepped outside into the crisp air, Seraphine joined him. They stood in silence for a moment, the stars shining faintly above. "You're different," she said finally, her voice soft. "I'm trying to be," he replied. "And I'll keep trying." Seraphine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then maybe there's hope for the rest of us, too." As he walked away, the letter tucked safely in his pocket once more, Calum felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose. Not the kind that came with numbers or accolades, but the kind that came with making a difference. And for the first time, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be.